Hi bakers, my name is Tanya and today we're going to do the bake along with the GBBO fan group. We're going to do sugar cookies that are decorated with royal icing. Royal icing can be a little bit intimidating for people. It takes some practice and you can definitely get it, and I'm going to show you today a couple of different techniques to make royal icing a little bit easier, a little bit more approachable for most people. There are a few things we need to get started. So in the download section I had provided my basic sugar cookie recipe along with the royal icing recipe, some alternatives, as well as the tools that you're going to need. I've also provided for you some shapes that we're going to use to make royal icing transfers. I'll show you what those are when we get to that section. You don't have to use these shapes, but I provided these because they're kind of fitting with the season, and I can show you kind of how to make a transfer without being super artistic. And it doesn't matter if you mess up because you can just move on and make another one. You're not going to ruin a cookie or anything like that, especially with something that's a little bit more intricate like the deer pattern. I've also provided for you some basic shapes. I'm going to use mostly cookie cutters, but I'll show you how to use the paper templates as well. I make paper templates for all of my gingerbread sculptures and some cookies if I either don't have a cutter or can't find a cutter that fits what I want to make. So you can cut these out instead of buying cookie cutters and use these to cut the shapes for your cookies. Go ahead and print those, or if you find something that you like better on the internet, go ahead and print those as well. One thing that I would recommend that you do when you're getting your materials and your tools together is make sure that if you're going to do a royal icing transfer, that the cookie cutters that you've chosen to use fit the shape that you want. So you know, you could use anything. You don't even have to go with these super scrolly. You could go with something simple like a square or a circle. Just make sure that your design fits inside with a little bit of extra space around the edges. So those are the basic tools that we're going to use. And the first thing that we need to do though before we can decorate our cookies with royal icing is make some cookies. So let's get baking. Okay, so while our cookies are finishing up in the oven, I'm going to get started on the royal icing. This is the main event and why I think most people are here. I'm going to use the bowl directly for my stand mixer, and I'm going to use a sifter. I like to sift my powdered sugar into the bowl first. It's not absolutely necessary, but sometimes if you don't sift it, you'll notice that your piping tips or your piping bag can get clogged, and that might be just a little bit of powdered sugar that was in a clump in the bag. So I always think it's safest to go ahead and sift first. And I am using an entire bag of confectioner's sugar. This is about 900 grams. You can have this recipe if you want to. Really depends on how many cookies you're making, how many colors you want, but you can also save royal icing. You can put it in the freezer or the refrigerator. It'll stay good in the refrigerator for about a week, or in the freezer for a couple of months. It will separate a little bit, so you'll need a little bit of mixing when you go to use it again. But it can be saved if you have too much from this batch. Another great thing to do if you have some, especially once you've mixed up your colors, I always have some that I don't use. And I don't want to just throw it away. I don't like to waste ingredients. So generally what I'll do is I'll either use it and pipe it in straight lines on parchment paper and then break it up after it dries, and you've got your own homemade sprinkles. Or you can make a bunch of smaller little detail type things. You could make flowers or bows or whatever kind of a design you think you might be able to use in the future. And I use a little fishing box, kind of a tackle box, with the little separated compartments, and I keep all those little designs. And then when I come up with a cookie design that I need a bow on a little girl's hair or you know, something like that, then I've already got these pre-made, they're already dried, and they're ready to just pop on my design. And I don't waste my royal icing. Okay, so I've sifted my 900 grams of powdered sugar or icing sugar right here into the bowl, and I'm going to pop this on a scale And you can use a measuring cup. Measuring cups usually have ounces on them. This is 5.5 ounces, but I'm going to measure out 155 grams. Now I am using a carton of pasteurized egg whites. You do want to make sure that it says pasteurized if you're using egg whites to make sure that it's safe to eat. But you can also, and I'm going to provide a recipe, okay, 155 grams. I'm going to provide a recipe for you that uses meringue powder. I've never personally used meringue powder. I don't buy it. So we always have egg whites in cartons in the house. My son eats them every day, which is why I use them. I feel like I have them, might as well use them. Meringue powder is basically egg whites that have been powdered, and they do have a little bit of cream of tartar in them, and there are a couple other things in there, mostly as preservatives, which is why one reason that I don't use them. But I am going to add my own cream of tartar. Now I have talked to Caro in Scotland, and one of the admins, and she said that she's posted in the announcements what is available in the UK and the way you guys can buy it there. I think you can already buy pre-made royal icing, which is amazing. I'm going to add about 1/8 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar. I don't measure this, I just put a little pinch in there. And then this is an optional ingredient, but I find that this really helps with the elasticity of my icing. I'm going to put about a tablespoon of light corn syrup in there. I give this a little bit of a stir because I don't want my powdered sugar to go everywhere. So I'm just kind of getting the egg whites mixed in with the powdered sugar to keep it from going all over. Okay. Now I haven't done a whole lot of mixing here. Just enough to keep it from going all over when I turn it on. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and use the paddle attachment. A lot of people you will see use the whisk attachment, and I will sometimes do that with royal icing, but one thing that I found is I get really frustrated when there are bubbles. I don't think they look good in the icing. So in order to keep the amount of air down to a minimum, I don't turn my mixer very high. I keep it on a medium-low, and I use the paddle attachment instead of the whisk, so I'm not whipping air into the icing, because I really don't want those bubbles. So I'm going to get it started on the lowest setting, make sure that my powdered sugar is incorporated. And then I'm just going to turn it up 1 notch. Okay, so our icing, that actually took about 5.5 minutes to get a nice, good, thick, you can see how thick that is. I lift up the mixer and it doesn't want to drip, it doesn't want to go anywhere. It's nice and thick. You could use this as a glue right now for gingerbread. So one of the first tips with your royal icing, one of the most important things is to make sure that you keep it covered, airtight, whenever you're not using it, because this stuff sets up very, very quickly. Now you can see how thick that is. When I pull my spatula up, it holds its shape. It's very thick. This is a perfect consistency for piping rosettes or any of the little details that you that you want your icing to stay really stiff. Now I'm going to use some cling wrap, and I'm going to put this right down over the icing. I'm going to push it right down on top of it, just like you would when you're making a custard or a pudding or anything like that. You don't want any air at all to get to that. Those crusty bits that form will clog your piping tips and make uneven spots on your decorations. So keep it completely sealed like that. If you're going to keep this, if you're not going to work with it right now, what I would do is put the cling film on top, and then I put a wet paper towel, just kind of a damp paper towel on top of that, and even throw a kitchen towel over the top to kind of keep it insulated and keep a little bit of moisture in. So now that we have our icing, we're going to go ahead and work on getting it colored and ready to go on the cookies. Okay, so before we mix our colors, one of the first things we're going to talk about is icing consistency. Consistency is really the most important part of using royal icing. If you don't get the consistency right, It's either going to, if you make it too thin, it's just going to run completely off your cookies, or if you make it too thick, you're not going to be able to pipe it and get the detail that you want. So consistency is really, really super important. Now this is directly out of the stand mixer. This is the thick icing. You can see that I've got some on my spatula and it is not going anywhere. When I put a blob here, I mean, I can keep a point. I can definitely hold a shape with this icing. And this is what I call stiff icing. So if I say you want stiff icing, this is what you use, the stuff right out of the mixer. Sometimes when you add color, especially if you're using a regular food coloring, it can thin your icing. So I definitely recommend coloring with gel food colorings because they're very, very vibrant. There are a million different colors available and they don't thin your icing as much. But if they do, you can always add just a tiny bit of powdered sugar, again sifted. If it thins your icing too much and you find that it's not stiff enough to hold the detail that you want, just add a little bit of powdered sugar, mix it in really well by hand, just using a small spatula, and you should be fine. I don't normally recommend just adding powdered sugar to stiffen up your icing because you're missing other ingredients that are really helping your icing set. So I would keep some of this stiff consistency white icing to the side. I usually mix all of my colors at the beginning, but I keep some white to the side. That way if I have to thicken something back up, I can just use a little bit of this directly out of the bowl. So now I'm going to show you what we do to get the next consistency. Now this, again, we said was our stiff icing. Now we're going to make icing that is a piping consistency. What I do is take however much you think you're going to need. Normally I would not color more than about a cup unless you're doing a large amount of cookies. You really don't need a whole lot more than that. I always find that I make too much and I end up with extra royal icing, which I don't like to do. So another tip, make sure that you use either a white bowl or a glass bowl. I prefer white because once I start adding my colors to it, if I'm using a colored bowl, like I have this bowl in teal, if I'm doing this in a teal bowl, I can't see the true color of the icing and how much icing I've put in. So I'm going to use this stiff consistency icing that I just took directly out of the mixer. And I'm going to use a little bit of a spray with a water bottle. You can find these water bottles everywhere. I think I got this one in like a pharmacy type of a store. I find this is a lot easier than using teaspoons, but you can always add about 1/8 of a teaspoon to a 1/4 teaspoon at a time until you get the right consistency. You do want to add water very, very slowly, which is why I prefer the spray bottle method, because I can really control how much I'm adding without adding too much. Once you thin it too much, it's a little bit harder to get it thicker. So just add a little tiny bit at a time and it should work for you. So I need this to be able to go through a piping bag and through a piping tip and lay down a straight line. If I tried to do that with the stiff icing, it's a little bit harder to lay it down and to drag it out and make outlines and letters and that kind of thing. So I'm going to make a piping consistency. I'm going to give this 2 squirts of water and then I'm going to mix it. I also find that this process right here helps to get rid of any air bubbles that were created in the stand mixer because I'm kind of flattening out the icing as I mix. Okay, so for a piping consistency, what I want is an icing that is about 25 seconds. Now what that means is when I make a design or when I drop some icing onto the top or draw a line in the icing, it's going to take about 25 seconds for it to settle down and that indentation or the line that I've made on top goes away. So to test that, to see if we've got our piping consistency, now remember we've only got 2 squirts of water in here, so we don't have a whole lot. I like to lay down a ribbon. Now see, this is still very thick, so you're not going to see much. I lay down that ribbon and then I look at it and I watch to see how long it takes for it to settle into the other icing. I'm looking for 25-second icing when I'm doing a piping. So I'm watching this and I'm seeing that it is going nowhere. It's not dissolving into the bowl. So I'm going to give it 2 more squirts and mix that in. And then we will test it again. Before you start a project, especially if you have multiple icings or multiple designs, I recommend making a list of the different colors that you need as well as the consistency that you need each color in. So let's go ahead and get on to the next consistency. So we've seen our stiff consistency here. I'm going to put a little bit of our piping consistency next to it. And you can see it kind of wants to hold a little bit of a shape, but it kind of settles down into itself. It's not going to hold a definite shape, but it's not going to go super smooth either on its own. So in order to get that nice, pretty, glossy, completely flat look on top of our cookies, we need to turn this into a flood consistency. So what we're going to do is add a little more water. To make sure that you add 1 squirt at a time, or if you're using teaspoons, just add 1/8 of a teaspoon at a time. I know that seems tiny, but even 1/8 of a teaspoon can make this go over. And now to make this a flood consistency, I'm looking for about a 15 to 20 second icing. So I'm going to add 2 more squirts of water and mix that in. And that is not quite ready, so we're going to give it 1 more squirt or 1 more 1/8 of a teaspoon. Now you will see a lot of people who, when they flood their cookies, and when I say flood, what I mean is cover the entire top of the cookie with the icing, which is kind of like your base icing. Some people will do a stiff outline and then put a flood consistency inside the outline. That's perfectly fine to do if that's the way you like to do it. I find that it takes a lot of time, and if I use a 15 to 20 second consistency icing to flood the entire cookie, I don't really need the outline. So I'm going to test this again. You can see how much looser it is coming off the spatula. The more you use this, the better you'll get at determining. Let's count it again and see. 1, 2, 3, 16, 17, 18. And I can see that my line here is just about gone. Sometimes your larger glops will not go in, but that line that I made here is basically gone at 18 seconds. So that is a perfect flood consistency icing. Okay, so we've got our white flood consistency icing, which we do need as the background on one of our cookies. So now that we've mixed that up, I'm going to go ahead and put it in a piping bag. So in order to get your piping bag ready, we're just going to cut off, and this varies depending on the piping bag, but on mine I cut off about 1 inch, just straight across. And then I'm going to take the bottom part of my coupler and I'm going to drop it right into the piping bag. Make it go all the way down to the bottom. And then I know I'm flooding with this icing, so I'm going to use a slightly larger tip. I'm going to put that on there and then screw it on with the little tightener. Now the reason that I like piping tips and couplers is because I can change that piping tip anytime I need to without having to change the bag. So the easiest way to get your icing into the bag is just take your piping tip, your piping bag with the tip in it, put it into a cup, open it up around the mouth of the cup, and then I just kind of get it on there kind of tight, use my fingers to open it up. Now I've got the bottom kind of twisted, so the icing is not going to go all the way to the tip yet, but this is going to be the easiest way to just pour this flood consistency icing directly into my bag. Be careful when you load your bags that you don't put in too much icing, because the more icing you put in there, the harder the bag can be to hold and to work with. And another little tip that I use, you don't have to use these, again, these are optional, is this little, it's kind of a twist tie, but I find them in the cake decorating section. When I take this out, you want to keep the air from getting to your icing. So I'm going to twist the end and put my little twist tie on there. Now you can tie a knot in the bag, you can use an actual twist tie. Oops, and I just missed the little nodule. This only happens when I'm being recorded. Okay, so I've got that on there. It's going to hold my icing for me. You do want to make sure that I usually wrap the ends until I'm ready to use them with a damp paper towel or a damp towel. Just covering them in some way, putting them inside a Ziploc bag or something to keep this from crusting up is a great idea. This little twist tie, although it's not necessary, it's super helpful in keeping air from getting to the bottom. Now, if you don't have couplers and piping tips, or you just choose not to use them, you can still use piping bags without them. The way that you use them, though, is very specific. You'll see that there's a seam down the side, and if I were to just cut a hole in the bottom of this piping bag, I would end up with an angled cut. So the most important thing to do if you don't want to use a piping tip is to make sure that your seams are on the top and the bottom. So I've opened up the bag and I've got that seam on the top, and I flatten it down all the way to the end. And then I cut just the tiniest little hole at the very, very, very bottom of the bag. And you may have to adjust that hole depending on what you're doing with it. A smaller hole is going to be perfect for writing letters or piping detail. A larger hole is going to be better for flooding. Okay, we're going to start with mixing our colors. Our first one that we're going to go for is orange. Now you're going to want to get your gel colorings out, you're going to want to use a toothpick. Once you dip it in here and go into the icing, you can't go back in here. So just make sure you get the right amount. It doesn't take much at all, and these dry darker than they look at the beginning. Put that into my icing and then use my little spoon or spatula to rub it off. And then this is going to get discarded. And I'm going to tell you also, these colors are so saturated that they will stain your skin. So if you are a hand model, you might not want to play with these. So now I'm just going to mix that in. I've just got about a cup of the white stiff consistency icing. Now I only need a tiny bit of this, so I am going to put that in a piping bag with a piping tip. And I check my list. I do need stiff consistency and piping consistency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, this is stiff consistency. I'm going to put some in the bag. And then what's left in my bowl, I will mix into the piping consistency. Here's another little handy trick. You don't want your icing to come spilling out. You do want to get it down to the end of the bag without breaking the bag. So what I do is I use these little Pampered Chef scrapers, but I'm sure people have all kinds of different silicone or rubber scrapers. Lay your bag flat on the counter and just push that icing right down to the bottom. This is great for when that icing starts to come back up here when you're working. You can never seem to get it down there with your hands. Now it is all ready to go, and I can put one of my bag ties on there and pop that in my wet paper towel to keep it moist. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mix all of the colors that I need. Go ahead and use your list, mix the colors that you need for the designs that you've chosen to do. You do not have to do all of these designs now. You can do one or two, or you can even come up with your own. But go ahead and mix all the colors in all the different consistencies that you need and get them in piping bags, and then we'll come back and we'll work on cookies.